and children. Being a woman of substance, a strong woman is an ideal woman. You cannot put her down because we learn from our mistakes, gather strength from our struggles, and overcome the obstacles with courage. This I dedicate to all women. Let us stand together for gender equality. A woman must be respected, first as a girl child, then as a wife, a mother and homemaker. Do not derogate her to a playing field for wild men. On children, there can be no keener revelation of society's soul than the way it treats its children. Nelson Mandela said, "The everyday differences we make in the lives of a child, we are judged," unquote. Mother Teresa elaborated, "I have found the paradox that if I love till it hurts, then there is no love, but there is no hurt, but more love to these orphans," unquote. I think a child brings that magic light to a house to transform it to a home. It is up to you parents. You, by your choice, have children. Raise them with care and love, discipline, and values, but no corporal punishment, please. Protect them from the predators of sexual abuse. I appeal to all of you parents not to flaunt your children on social media as an easy target for perverts. As panelists, we have Professor Harindra De Silva, Emeritus Professor of the University of Colombo, Founder Chairman of the National Child Protection Authority, NCPA, who has a vast experience and knowledge on children and abuse. Shima Ahmad, a final year student in Business Information, Systems, Software Engineering, and was a member of the Model United Nations Movement, MUN, founder of Dawn Group of Companies, software development firm revolutioning in partnerships on the global scale. Shiranti Senanayaka, a lawyer, founder president of the Young Legal Professionals Association of SL, founder president of Hype SL, which is the country's first youth empowerment incubator, has been a global ambassador for youth opportunities and a woman deliverer of young leaders. She is a recipient of the Princess Diana Award for 2020. Last but not least is Lasantha Mendes, Director, Lead Microfinance Specialist, Sri Lak Jaya Credit Plus Limited, and founder of Avanka Lanka, working with vulnerable communities, providing access to finance the poor, welfare of protection of workers, plantation workers, prisoners, and rehabilitation of sex workers. Starting with you, Professor Harindra De Silva, tell us your experiences and your views and what you make of all these children who are being abused on a daily basis.
When I was training in the UK in Birmingham, when I saw children who were physically abused, I told them that Sri Lanka has a Dharmishta society, which was the key word at that time, and that we don't see it. But when I came back to Sri Lanka, I started identifying with others. There were others who were also involved in identifying and documenting cases of child abuse. And then those are physical abuse, and then sexual abuse was also found. Later on, I extended the abuse to, in a way, to the conscription of children, the aspects of thing, and then the documentation was done through research publications. Same time, late 90s, I was invited to be a member of the task force on child protection, presidential task force on child protection, and I was the chairman there. And then we went to set up the legislation to form the statutory body, the National Child Protection Authority. So I was the founder chairman, and I functioned there for the maximum period that was allowed, but just 6 years. So I think one of the problems is that child abuse is a hidden phenomenon. There is not only physical abuse and sexual abuse, there is a lot of emotional abuse as well. And even when it comes to physical and sexual abuse, again there is a emotional component as well. Now, what is important to realize is when a child is abused during the formative years, one of the biggest problems is that certain impressions, the trauma gets imprinted in the brains of these children, not in the main brain, which is the cortex, but in the lower centers, which is called the hypothalamus. And then at certain times in adult life or maybe youth, some of these things come up, and then in other words, I created the phrase at some point, today's abuse become tomorrow's abusers. So I think it's important to understand the intergenerational abuse that takes place, and that is the reason why we are seeing this over and over again. And then of course the aspects I think we focused on was so many aspects of prevention, giving knowledge and so on. Maybe we have time at some point to talk about it. And then also of course going back to the issue of COVID-19, I think there would have been, although it's not that well documented, there are stories about it, but when there is lockdown, there is also a chance of increased abuse because the children are in constant contact with the parents and the people at home. And also at this point I would like to say that abuse of children happens mainly by the people close to you, not by outsiders. It doesn't mean they don't get abused by outsiders, but much more by the family members and the extended family members. So when you're in a lockdown situation, those issues can be a problem. And then increased screen times, eating habits, obesity that goes on with inactivity, and all that sort of thing are issues that affect children. I think there are lots of things that can be done. We'll be talking about it later, I suppose.
Thank you very much. What a wealth of experience, and thank you for letting us know, and the viewers, all your experience, sharing it with us. Shiva, you represent an ethnic minority. It's a pride for us to have you here. What is your take on women and children, the way they are treated by society?
Thank you, Ms. Minoli, for that. I believe women and children all over the world itself as an agenda is quite a vast topic. However, if we were to narrow it down to a certain extent, I would start off with the exploitation of these two parties. There are different types of exploitation that these two parties come across. Firstly sexual, then it goes on to labor, forced marriages, forced criminality, child soldiers, or organ harvesting as well. So as you mentioned, I do come from a specific minority in Sri Lanka. Well, something that a lot of people focus on here in Sri Lanka is how women and children here in Islam, or the religion of Islam, is. Firstly, for women, forced marriages is something that a lot of people talk about here in Sri Lanka. The thing is, Islam never forces marriage onto anyone. It is so how these concepts have come over time is basically because at a certain point in time there were a lot of men who were the rulers, right? So when the Quran is of course the truth, but beyond that there are a few other books that were written by different people. So those books were ideologies that certain people thought of, and those were the ones that were passed down. So when someone, say for example, I read a book in Islam which is basically something in line with my opinions, I would of course follow it a lot, and I would talk to everyone else as if this guy from a long time ago also wrote this book, and he's saying the truth about what is to be followed. So some people, some families actually in Sri Lanka or Asia, I would say, focus on getting women married as soon as they're done with their education, that too without giving them a chance to go for higher education despite the fact that they want to pursue their careers in educational aspects and stuff. Moving on from that, there is also another ideology that people think about in Islam. They say that Muslim men make sure that the women has to be at home and has to be in the kitchen, right? Work from home in the kitchen and provide for the family. Well, that's not actually true. Not all Muslim men who are grown in good families are taught this, but for the ones who follow Islam, like beyond as to what just some people in the past followed, they would of course say, like I mentioned before, as long as it goes on with their ideologies, they would always promote whatever it is that's in line with that. A small example of it is the Holy Prophet of Islam, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Well, his wife Khadija radiallahu anha, she was the one who financed the Muslim movement against the ones who rebelled against Islam when it was brought forward. So that, I believe, is something that a lot of people has to take an example out of. Apart from that, there is also another thing, the whole concept of the Muslim women having to cover themselves and all that as well. That also was brought at the time of the prophets, but at that point when this was the reason why this was introduced was because the men at that point in that certain era were quite corrupt, and in order to protect the woman or their women, they were asked, they were not forced to, they were asked to cover themselves through a certain throughout their body. This was only to protect them. But so there are two concepts in Islam, one being obligatory and one being optional. So these kind of things like covering your face and stuff is always optional. It's not obligatory, but performing 5 times daily prayers and stuff like that is of course obligatory for us. So Islam is not Islam is a theology. It's a set of practices that make you go towards a proper life, having a successful and peaceful life. It's not a set of instructions that is being given to you, something that oppresses you despite of your freedom. Apart from that, there is also
you mean radicalization is not in Islam?
Not in Islam,
right? So thank you for letting us know, because everybody paints you with one brush, saying, "Oh, Muslim, so they are radicals." So tell us exactly what is expected of you all.
Well, what's expected of us is basically
more than spiritual.
Like I said, Islam is always a set of practices, right? So even with the cases of haram and halal, haram is basically something that is prohibited in terms of beliefs, okay, or practices. So what I would say is basically Islam is not, it's just a way of life. It's a way of life. It's a way of carrying out some kind of something that you're spiritually believing in. There's also another thing where a lot of men or a lot of people, they say, I had, through personal experience, I have a lot of friends who has been like, there's relationships and stuff. So the second someone outside of Islam comes and dates another guy who's a Muslim, the first thing they say, or their parents say, is, "Oh God, he's Muslim, he's going to oppress you, he's going to make sure that you," especially in the Moor community, it's a strong belief that the Moor community oppresses their women, tells them to stay at home, makes them stay at home, makes them work for them, makes them do all the chores. It's not the case in Islam. It's not the case in Muslim families. Most Muslim families allow all sorts of women, every woman out there, to have their own freedom, to have their own life, to fend for themselves. And there's a lot of Muslim campaigns also that a lot of people are not aware about, on women empowerment and stuff. So I think those are all aspects that this show can also bring out to the general public as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Shiranti, what have you got to say about women? You are involved with women, women power. Tell the viewers, what do you expect to see of a woman? And what's the level that we have to come up to so that we are not a second class to the males?
That's true. So I would like to begin by saying that women and children have been identified as vulnerable communities by the World Health Organization since its inception in 1948. So since 1948 until 2020, we need to really talk about why is it that the same groups of persons like women and children are repetitively regarded as vulnerable communities. I mean, there has to be some sort of systematic problem that we are not addressing if women and children are repetitively considered to be vulnerable. So I think that there are several systematic factors, actually 3 systematic factors that I would like to talk about. But before that, I would like to sort of highlight a few important statistics. So firstly, according to the UN Population Fund, what we see is 1 out of 4 women in Sri Lanka have experienced some form of sexual abuse before the age of 18. So what we also see is 1 out of 3 women globally and also in Sri Lanka have experienced intimate partner violence. And another interesting statistic is, so I was reading this Asia Foundation report, which actually revealed that in the past decade, there has been a 40% increase in the number of rape cases and incest cases that have been reported. So even though these numbers are things that we actually hear quite often, we don't really understand what these statistics and this data actually implies, because I feel that we are living in an age where there is a paradoxical parallel phenomenon that is happening. What I mean by that is, when we take the feminist movement as a whole, we see that as an ideology, women are encouraged to empower themselves. Women and children especially are seen as communities that require empowerment. But at the same time, if you really go to the grassroots, the reality is that you don't see the same level of empowerment that we see on a surface level. For example, we see women taking great strides in professions where they're appointed as CEOs, or we have women scientists in NASA. But these achievements of certain professional women, I feel, actually sort of gloss over the ground realities and the grassroots realities, which is the fact that women still and are abused, and so are children. And I feel that especially when it comes to children, the incidents that were reported in the news of the gruesome ways in which these children were sexually abused also sort of reveals more or less rather a very dark and a very distorted sexual inclination of a lot of predators that are out there. So in my opinion, there are 3 systematic factors that we have to address in order to actually empower women. So but before I go on to that, I would like to highlight that, see, exploitation and especially sexual abuse is not only an experience of just women and girl children, and that even male children are actually prone to it. And a problem that I have noticed, especially when it comes to male children, which I will briefly describe, is the fact that Section 363 of our Penal Code only defines rape as a peno-vaginal penetration. So we don't really have, men are technically cannot be raped according to the legal definition of Sri Lanka, and this is problematic because I've been part of cases where there are young boys who actually were raped by their family members or even outsiders, and they have not been able to claim rape, so they claim sexual abuse, which is a completely different offense altogether. But leaving that aside, since we're focusing purely on women and children in this particular topic, I would like to focus on 3 main factors. Firstly is this idea of this intergenerational implication that women play a very domesticated role. I feel that this is something that we pass down from generation to generation, and see, we often portray women to be the caregiver of the family, the sensitive party, or the mother, and there is this idea that in order to be the best mother or the best caregiver, you are required to serve the role of a very domesticated housewife. And I do understand that if you do take the choice of being a mother, that you have a huge responsibility. But I also feel that we don't highlight enough that it is the choice of the woman, how he or she wishes, rather, how she wishes to best serve in the capacity of a mother. So I feel that the solution I would like to put forward with regards to to breaking this intergenerational implication that women serve a domestic role. And I think that is actually one reason why this term second-class citizen comes forward, because women, especially when they serve a domestic role, what I've noticed is they're not financially independent because they're not employed, so they're at the mercy of the income of their husbands. So the solution I would like to really put forward is to sort of have mindset changes both at a family level and especially at a school level, because I feel at school we sort of learn subjects that don't really have a direct implication on our practical lives. So if we are able to, for example, teach our girl children in school that you also have the same right to secure employment when you are older, you have the right, for example, not to be a mother as much as you have a right to be a mother, or perhaps get into marriage. So I feel that even at a school and a family level there should be an empowerment of the girl child and young women as a whole. Then the second phenomenon I want to talk about is this lack of awareness that exists amongst women and children about the rights system and certain legal mechanisms. For example, if you actually especially go to the estate sector and if you talk to, I think Ms. Mendis will also agree with me, that one problem is the fact that there is a lack of awareness where women and children are unaware that there are conventions granting their rights, that they have set human rights which cannot be violated and which is inalienable to them. And we also see that there's a lack of awareness even on simple things like how do you really file a police complaint, or how, for example, do you call a hotline and file a complaint about abuse. And what I also see is that this lack of awareness is a principal reason why especially women do not really take it upon themselves to report the abuse that they go through. So again, I feel that this also requires perhaps especially a grassroots level awareness, and in the context of policymakers, for them to understand that legal education should be compulsory civic education, that citizens should be aware of what our legal recourses are. And the final fact I would like to talk about is this absence of civic participation and civic policing when it comes to domestic abuse, because I feel especially domestic abuse in Sri Lanka is considered to be a very private thing. It happens behind closed doors. For example, if it happens in your neighbor's home, it's considered to be your neighbor's experience and your neighbor's problem. So if you, for example, see someone in your neighborhood being abused, it may be a child or may be a fellow woman, what we see is both men and women are disinclined to report against it because it's considered not to be their problem. So I feel that we, of course, whilst understanding that privacy is important, I feel privacy shouldn't be more or less at the cost of someone's quality of life and bodily integrity. So I feel that we require greater civic action in terms of reporting cases that happen, especially in the locality and the proximity of it. So I feel that, to sum up my opening remarks, I feel that we need to sort of take a very multifaceted approach, as in see empowerment of women and children and combating exploitation. It's not a one-dimensional approach. And what I feel is Sri Lanka takes a very reactionary measure, as in when the incident happens we react to it and we don't really have a precautionary measure. So in the solution round, or perhaps the discussion round, it would be fantastic if we can talk about how we change this reactionary approach into a more preventive approach.
Thank you. Excellent. Before we speak to Mr. Mendis, Lasantha Mendis, could we have the clip so that he could talk about his work, please? Is a southerner who has been brazen enough to go into North Sri Lanka, to see to their needs and to make everybody else in the South aware of the real suffering and the reality of life in that part of our country.
First of all, thank you, Minoli, for inviting me today. Yes, my journey to Jaffna started in 2004 during the ceasefire. And a group of us, we traveled by road from Colombo to Jaffna. And when we were traveling, I think we went in 4 cars. We were all in tears by the time we got to Jaffna, seeing the devastation, the mass devastation by the side of the roads. In our group were 2 ladies who lost their husbands to the war. And we had a kind of a reconciliation, time of reconciliation with the northern widows. And it was a very moving moment. And, the northern widows, that was the first time they realized, my God, there are widows on the other side. And for our 2 widows too, it was a real eye-opener. And they found that the northern widows were poorer and economically much more vulnerable. And this started our love for Jaffna. That was in 2004. And soon after, in December, when we had the tsunami, I was traveling down to Galle, and everybody in the vehicle was getting very emotional and sad, but nothing was happening to me. I was wondering, what is wrong with me? Why am I not getting upset about it? Then I suddenly remembered that I had seen worse devastation in Jaffna. So anyway, the war broke out, and we couldn't go to Jaffna, but we kept on going soon after the war finished. But we realized that everybody said Sri Lanka will just take off after the war, and that development, it will be true, Asia's miracle and all that. But what I realized was, in a country like Sri Lanka, where we have, I took a count recently, we have 18 ethnic groups. I am sure I missed out a couple, so we may be having about 25. So in a family where we will say you have, leave about 25, you have 10 children. If 3 or 4 children are all the time being oppressed or suffering, or they feel that they are oppressed, how can a family grow? A family will never develop. So with this in mind, we thought, this same group, now we call ourselves Love Jaffna, we just thought, let's go and try to do something in the north, to build the trust, with the northerners. And when we went, and we went to the Ministry of Women's Affairs, and they said, look, there is this village that we just stumbled upon. Can you come and just take that over? So it was a very manageable size, 40 families. So we went and we visited this village for the first time with the officials. And there were, in this group of officials, there was one Sinhalese girl, and then she spoke to me in Sinhala, and she pointed out to a family and told me, sir, these people have nothing to eat now. And he said, we are also government servants, we can't support them. So I was horrified. So that day I was staying in Jaffna, so I went back and got them some provisions and came back. And we decided, we must adopt this village. So we have adopted this tiny village called Impachole in Watukotte South, where we want to really build it up with southern support, to show the southern solidarity, hopefully anticipating that there will be more southerners who will replicate it. And I must say, the cooperation, the support from the people as well as the authority have been amazing. And so we have started this journey, and when we look around, we also see that the poor, especially in the north, are economically very backward, not because of anything else, because since the war ended, which is over a decade, there hasn't been much development. If you see, all the development is Jaffna centric. When you go 10 kilometers away, there is nothing, when I say nothing, comparatively no development. So we are also involved in trying to empower the cooperative, the poor through the cooperative movement, because Jaffna has had a very rich cooperative history, and we are trying to help them with that. Plus, now we have this other organism and organization in the making called Avankalanka, where we are trying to help the farmers as well, So to make Jaffna, and the north, to come back to its original, state, where Jaffna was very economically active, economically very strong, and I believe that's the only way Sri Lanka will develop. If we develop the north and the east, then the entire country comes on to one, one platform.
On that note, we have to go in for the short commercial break. Don't go away, please. We shall be back shortly. Welcome back to Talk Walk, the talk show that is making a difference in post-COVID, in the new normal. We had a very interesting discussion from Lasantha, who is trying to bring about reconciliation. That's what we all need, between the south, the north, and the east. Please, Lasantha, go ahead and elaborate on what you were saying.
Yeah, thank you, Melvin. So as I said, I think it is time that the educated public, takes their stand, because when we think of civil society, we always think of the masses, the big organizations, the grassroots organizations. But what about the educated public? We are the ones who are involved in policy. If you are in the private sector, we contribute towards the GDP, we pay the taxes, if you are in business, you run you run so many enterprises, so, but if you see, we are the most silent, so this is why we started Avankalanka, which is an organism and an organization in the making, to challenge the educated public to join hands, in finding solutions. Don't wait until the government finds solutions. So that is why you see me wearing this attire. It is actually a statement, to make to show that Sri Lanka does not belong to the politicians. Sri Lanka belongs to you and me. And whenever I wear this, people ask me, whether I am trying to aspire to get into politics. That's not the issue. The issue is, where do we stand? And Avankalanka, that is what we are trying to do. And we were talking earlier about abuse and all that. If you really see again, it is the man who has let down the family. It is the man who has either become a drunkard, or a druggie, which has made the wife, vulnerable. So she has to either go to the Middle East or go to do jobs, and that's the phenomenon is the same, you know, whether it is in the north or in the south or even most probably in the east, you know. So we have taken a few projects like that, you know. One is the Jaffna, then we see the, as Chiranti quite rightly said, the plantation worker. You know, if you see the plantation worker, you know, the only time politicians talk of plantation workers at the time of election or at the time of a strike.
Quite right.
So if they don't ask for a wage increase, well, forget about them. You know, well, at the time of election, entice them for a wage hike. You know, so but if you take, they are about 800,000 people population. You know, how can we forget them? You know, they can't. So this is another group, a very vulnerable group, which we are looking at. Also, if you look at the prisoners, you know, you actually put prisoners, you know, people are put into prison to become better human beings. But what we have been hearing, you know, in the past couple of weeks and months is quite to the contrary, you know. So I think these are areas which you and I can get involved, you know, and and try to help them. Now you look at the farmers. COVID showed us the importance of the farmers. If we didn't have the local farmers, we would have died, you know. But it also highlighted the problems the farmers have, you know, the issues the farmers have. And these problems the farmers have been having for decades. And that is why the younger generation of farmers have moved out of farming, you know. So in that respect, we are trying to work in the north, actually with the farmer community, to get them the benefits that the government is promising. You know, all governments, successive governments have, in good faith, have promised, you know, so many things to the farmers. But what happens is the policymaker is there. When it goes down to the grassroots, it's a different story. So we have taken upon ourselves to get on to the field, you know, and try to work with the machinery, the government machinery, and ensure that the farmers are looked after, so that they will keep on doing their farming. And Sri Lanka, which is anyway an agriculture based country,
Absolutely.
you know, will thrive, you know, just not survive, you know. And with all this smart agriculture and all that, we can really do something. Because if you take the water base also, a majority are from the rural areas, you know, and out of that, majority is from the farming, you know. So I think these are the challenges, you know, I put forward to the educated public, because unfortunately we are very good at criticizing governments on social media. If we can run a government via social media, Sri Lanka will have the best government, right? But you tell them to come, you know, to do something, you know, whether it is in the north and the south, I feel, when you talk, they have all the problems and the solutions, but when you tell them to come visit, let's go to Jaffna, let's do something, they have all the excuses. So I think I'll stop for now and maybe continue later.
Thank you so much. I think the main issue here is that we as Sri Lankans must be one. We must be one Sri Lanka. No divisions of east, west, north, south. And you talking about the farmers, if we can be self-sufficient, Sri Lanka, that will be the greatest economic challenge that we will take on. Anyone of you want to add to what they has to say?
Can I just?
Professor, yes?
Yeah, I think everybody has contributed very well actually to the discussion. Just to add on, I think it's just that we need to address the issues across the board, not necessarily the grassroots, and as Asantha said, the middle level or the top, the people. I mean, there should be a change in behavior, a change in attitudes, changing sort of practical ways of doing things and behavior is what can bring about a change. And that cannot be brought down top down. You can't dictate and do things like that. You can't expect it to start at the grassroots, even though I think he's trying to stimulate a grassroots project. But then we have to have a wider scale, more extensive, where people have to join hands with projects like that, or maybe separate people who emulate his project. So, I think it is important that change in behavior is important, and it is the mindset. And also it is important to realize, thinking of child abuse, is that the mindset change is mainly during childhood and youth. When you are an older person, it is very difficult to change their mindset, because they have already formed their preconceptions and so on and so forth, that their own notions are already in them, and it is very difficult. So, I think you have to start from childhood, not necessarily preventing child abuse or abuse of children, but also giving them the correct ideas, and not sort of putting into their minds that we are the greatest, we in the past, in our history, our leaders occupied this place or that place, and we dominated over certain groups of people and so on. I mean, that is very nice in terms of history. We have everybody has gone through that, but that can be harmful, because you grow up to become an adult who will also want to have the same preconceptions and then try to dominate and so on and so forth. That leads not only to racism, but not only to gender issues, not also necessarily child abuse, or economic conquest is also part of that way of thinking. I think it is important that there should be the leadership should look forward to change that, not from a top down point of view, but to stimulate a bottom up process, and it is the responsibility of the leadership to stimulate that process. Not that they are going to do it, they can stimulate it, and you do not expect the grassroots to do it. Maybe the middle groups can go on, and it need not necessarily be a free program. I always believe in the Chinese proverb, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, you feed him for life. So, it is the sort of vocational training which is important in programs like you, which will keep that, because you won't be able to sustain your program. Once you empower that particular village, and when they are self-sufficient, you can shift to another place. I mean, there are hundreds and thousands of different similar places across the country. So, I think it is important that sort of thinking processes should work.
Talking about the predators of child abuse, despite the Act number 50 of 1998, how is it that we see predators of abuse released and they are being at large till they find the next victim?
Yeah, I think it is not necessarily the Act number 50 of 1998, which was the establishment of the Child Protection Authority, which gave some guidance, and I was mainly behind the Act at that point, because it was done by the Child Protection Task Force. But I think what was important is the 1995 amendment to the Penal Code, amendment number 22, which brought in a lot of laws in against abuse of women and children. I think it was a very good act, but however, I have reservations about that, although I was elated at the beginning. Now, seeing the practice of it, I think on one hand it is fairly strong law, and there are mandatory sentences, right? And as a result of that, people don't stick to it. And also there is no process by which we monitor the sentencing. We don't monitor the action by the police. So, I think in terms of child abuse and child prevention or child abuse, the most important thing is the prevention of child abuse, as I think you mentioned. And in the prevention process, it is the knowledge base which is important, giving knowledge to everybody across the board, not only children, not only parents, but also people across the board, and also the fact that We need to give skills to people to how to avoid being abused, how to avoid getting angry and abusing children. Those are skills that you need to do. And the last thing is the legislation. Once the child is abused, I think the damage is done. But the legislation is important in a way to make sure that those people are not there, won't continue to do that, but to instill some fear. But still people do that, because if the law is not effective and if there is impunity in the country, right, then it's going to be broken. Because it's like going on the road. We drive on the road, we see a double line and we need to overtake, we overtake on the double line. Nobody takes action, there is nobody there to catch us, there are no cameras to do that. And then we are stopped at some certain points. Still we can evade the problem by showing our for example a doctor's ID, then you are pardoned, right. So there is no fixed thing about law. So in terms of breaking the law, in terms of child abuse or women's abuse, if the law is not effective, you do it once, you get away, you do it twice. Someone has use your influence and get out of it, right, and then you keep on doing it. So legislation alone is not going to help, and that is the last thing in terms of controlling this problem.
Thank you so much. So discipline has to be instilled in your...
That's the legislation, that's the discipline part, but it has to be internal discipline in
so
terms of mindfulness
as children,
and so on.
As children you have to be taught this.
Yeah, taught, not in the term of discipline with a cane or something like that, but just given the correct ideas, attitudes, and children will also emulate your own behavior. If you are good, if you are mindful, if you are considerate about other people, children will also learn to be that.
Absolutely, lead by example.
Yeah.
That's what it
Exactly.
is.
Actually, I have a few statements to bring out with regards to what Professor mentioned previously as well. He stated that it was all a matter of mindset, and just to add on to whatever he said just now as well, if it is practiced at home, I believe, the children would obviously emulate what the father or the parents are pursuing. Also, with regards to what Mr. Lasantha Mendes brought out, he stated as to how, as to a way, he asked us as to a way to get everyone to think of the same way, to help everyone across the country, right? Cross country, as in west, east, north, and south, all coming together. Well, I believe again with that, I've identified 3 types of people here. One is the type of people who does everything, like Mr. Lasantha Mendes, helps out people but are not voiced out enough. Then there is the ones who voices out what they want to do but does not do anything about it. And then there is another one that does not voice out or does not do anything about it. So I think again linking the two, I think that can also be instilled with the house itself, because if the parents or whoever it is does this, now say for example, you will find one, if you take 2 men and each of them earns a salary of 20,000 each, and one person earns 20,000 and one person earns 40,000, for example. The guy who has 40,000 earns 40,000 a month. If he gives 20,000 out of his salary for a particular reason, that's like he's giving 50% out of it. But if the person who's earning 20,000 gives 18,000 or 20,000 itself for charity or helps another person out, that's a matter of perspective, that's a matter of mindset. He's helping everyone with whatever he has, right? So if you can compare the two, I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but the child of those 2 people would always think of the same mindset as what the father endorses in them, right? So that's something I would like to bring to the table.
Quite right. I think charity must be taught to children, how to share. We are becoming a very selfish nation, thinking only about ourselves. Shriranti, I want you to elaborate why women are treated badly, actually women victims of violence. When they go to a police station, they are asked to go home, make up with the predator or the abuser. Why does that happen?
Okay. That's actually like a very interesting question, simply because the approach that we always take in the existing legal system, in my opinion, is this idea that reconciliation with the abuser is more or less the best option, especially in mediation. I've actually sat at mediation experiences where there has been a mediating party and the lady or the victim would always come and say, my husband beats me up, he comes home drunk, I have and I have been raped in my marriage. And this is also a predominant problem in Sri Lanka. We don't have marital rape. It is assumed that simply because you are in a marital construct that there is consensual sexual relations. So one issue that we see is that we see this idea of reconciliation being our first approach first approach and the only approach rather sometimes to actually bringing the victim in domestic abuse and intimate partner violence as well as the abuser. And I think it has a lot to do with this I've actually attended especially mediation trainings and certain trainings that are actually given to police officers with regards to dealing with complaints that are filed by victims of domestic abuse. And when you actually go through the curriculum that they teach, what they encourage is for you to first try and reconcile the parties. So that's the first approach that even the curricula actually teaches these officers. I mean, whilst understanding that reconciliation is of course positive pathway of going about it, that being at the cost of the victim is, I think, the biggest problem, because they often take they don't evaluate the realities. And even if it's a very dire case of domestic abuse, they always say that you should go back to your husband and you should actually try and work things out. And another problem is the children are sort of brought in as into the equation, and the mother is sort of guilt tripped into thinking, what about the children? Should you not essentially be with your husband for the children? I believe that the family unit is of course the most important unit of society, but at the same time I feel the well-being and the health of women in families should not come at the cost or should not be the cost for actually keeping abusive relationships together. So I think it has a lot to do with the approach that we take.
I think more. Yes,
Yeah.
certainly.
I think it's an important point. I don't think when we talk about penal code offences, they are offences not necessarily against that person but against the society. Therefore, reconciliation doesn't come into the equation as far as I am concerned.
Absolutely.
Unless you change it to take it out of penal code and then have this. But we have adversarial system, right? We don't have the Eurasian.
Shall we continue it after a short commercial break?
Sure.
Okay.
Don't go away. Please stay with us. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back to Talk Walk. We are at a most interesting part of our episode where parents, I feel, should never send their children for advertisements. Some things that they're lost in their own life, they push their children into, and they become easy targets for predators. What have you all to say about that? Because they are on every advertisement possible. They are put on social media. Do you agree that children should be exposed on social media?
Well, I think that all comes down with the family name that we were speaking about. I think some parents, especially in the Asian context, want their children to be better than their colleagues' children's, etc. So
Competition.
Yes, competition. And in order to get that, to tell their peers about their children proudly, they have to have something with regards to this. So some parents from the time of their child's birth, they plan their child's life out entirely, and this pushes the child into an uncomfortable situation sometimes, and the child is forced to go through or go forward with a career that he or she never chooses until the age of at least 18 or 21, which is after then only they can voice out their opinions and actually make a difference in terms of that. So do you have anything?
This happens, in psychological parlance, where you're supposed to reach your normal milestones. When you don't reach it, parents look for it through their children. They pressure them so much, and then there's mental illness. That is the end result. Children are breaking down with mental problems because of the pressure given by their own parents. You want to add to it, Professor?
Yeah, I think there was at a previous point, there was, when I was chairperson, there was a movement to stop this advertising by children. There were arguments for and against. One of the issues is the exploitation of the children. Whatever the money the child gets goes to the manager or the parents, and they may be using it up. Now this has happened in the US, and a certain percentage has to now go to the child, and so on. So others say, you have a movie or a teledrama, you cannot have a family setup or whatever without a child. These arguments come and go. There are pluses and minuses, but I think overall exploitation of children in the media is one of the biggest problems that we come across, and we have to take precautions against that, rather than taking banning all children from any form of media may not be practically possible, because there is also a very huge commercial element here, and fighting against a commercial element is not going to be easy.
Thank you.
I just do have one thing to add. I mean, see, living in a day and age of social media, it's very difficult for us to tell people not to share, things that are of their personal experiences. I feel that, for example, if you are to put, let's say, your child's achievement, that is a very different construct versus documenting your every move, because especially in the US and the UK, so from this findings that I have actually come across, one tool that's utilized by sexual predators to actually monitor and abduct children is the post that their parents put up on social media saying, okay, I'm at the park today with my daughter, or I, for example, went to buy her clothes at this particular place. But I feel if there is a daily record of your whereabouts with your children, I feel that is a utilization or a tool that can be utilized by predators. But I also feel that one recourse that we need to adopt is where we teach children how to actually identify sexual predators, because I feel a lot of young kids are very unaware of being cautious of strangers coming and talking to them, because children are naturally very friendly. So I feel whilst we actually look at setting up the system, in my opinion, I feel even children, we should teach them in a language that they understand, that there is a lot of dangers out there for them that they have to be wary about. Because I feel like before we used to have that idiom or statement that used to say, don't take candy from strangers, but that was something that that our parents used to always tell us. But I feel that we have to have more or less, even from a school level, perhaps awareness program on how children can specifically be wary of people that have certain, because I feel sexual predators have certain general habits that they do portray, where we are able to make children aware of identifying such characteristics. But that's, I feel, because unless and otherwise the children themselves are careful, there is so much that I feel a caretaker and guardian can also do.
Moving forward with that, just to add on to your caretaker and guardian perspective. Well, I think also the term psychiatrist or counseling here in Sri Lanka is also something that's taken for granted. It's not in the right places as well, because see, for example, you find a lot of people through personal experience. I could vouch for this. You find a lot of people who claim to be psychiatrists who are specialized in different fields, to be honest, because they create companies, they create organizations, and they tend to be the ones who you can go to for advice, but in the end of the day they end up giving the wrong advice because they're not professionally trained, and this can be the reason for a whole lot of bad decisions made by a certain child.
No, I think I totally agree with you. I think one of the problems is that we do have psychologists, but they are not employed by the government. We don't have cadre provision for psychologists or counselors in the government hospital or health system. Of course, psychiatrists are needed, they are all needed, the child psychiatrists are needed, but they have a different role to play. Psychologists will play another role, and in terms of child abuse, once the damage is done, the only solution is not necessarily to go to the police and the law. That is important, but that is not the solution for the child. For the child, right, what is important is to reconstruct the damage that is already done. As I said before, it is today's child who is abused who become tomorrow's abusers. So if you are going to prevent child abuse, I think it's important to realize that in this generation, if you reduce the amount of child abuse, in the next generation there will be less child abusers. And if you increase the amount of counseling and the psychological treatment that is given, you will have still, even though they have been abused, they will be able to get out of that abusive mindset that they have. I mean, there are lots of reasons why they become abusers later on in life, but not everybody. I think it's important that only a small percentage, but if you take, for example, in a study that I did, we found that 12% of a student population that we studied had abused a child. And out of that group, 65% had been abused as children. But if that was prevented, that would have been much less. And then if they were treated properly in terms of counseling, again that number would have gone down. So it's a long term, it's an intergenerational issue, and we can't just put a stamp and then put an end to child abuse. It is a process that has to go on. It's like anything else, whether it is poverty or poverty elevation or women's rights or racism, whatever, the process has to go on. And unless we start now, we do it properly, we will miss a few generations.
So psychologists are underutilized. I can speak with experience. So you don't have to go to a psychiatrist with a problem, because psychiatrists will help you with your mental illness, but not with your trauma. Trauma, you have to have a counseling process. Do you agree? That's my way of thinking. That's how I was taught.
I totally agree with you, because now if you take the North, you see the teenagers, these are children, teenagers who were maybe very small children during the war, and because of the trauma, in this little village where we work, you ask the teenagers, what do you want to be? What do you want to do? They have no clue. They just look at you, and to me, my heart breaks when I see that. The younger children who have, been born after the war are quite different. They'll say, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be a doctor, whatever. But the teenagers, it's devastating, when you see that.
Yeah, I think just to add on, sometimes they may want to be somebody who carries a gun, because they are seeing the people who carry guns being adored, so they are role modeling and things may be different. I don't know, you may not have gone through it, because I did a big study on recruitment of child soldiers, having studied child soldiers, and one of the main reasons why they joined was they loved people carrying guns, and basically some of the issues was, for example, children's playgrounds at that time, with the seesaws, they had AK-47 toy guns fixed at each other, so that they were, while going up and down, these small kids, they shoot at each other. So basically what was happening was the mindset was being changed, right? So some of them who, they may be scared to talk about it to you, but if you really go into sort of a psychological analysis, they may want to be something which they focused on when they were small kids.
No,
Yeah, that
maybe,
may be
maybe
also true.
idealizing as well.
Yeah,
but then
idealizing.
they are now frozen. Their
Yeah,
mind
Yes.
is frozen with emotions.
Yes.
So that is why they're staring into space, because they can't think any further. It is really heart-rending. I'm really sorry to be empathetic.
Exactly, and
towards
that is
them.
why I was actually trying to agree with you, where you said counseling is of paramount
Importance,
you know, to
absolutely.
get them out, to think outside the box,
I think it dies down to
Reversing therapy.
Yeah, I think it dies down to what the adults in that specific area wants to, the initiatives that the adults want to take towards the younger generation. Because also there's another example that I can bring to the table. We visited this school in Monaragala. I could say it out. The principal over there, well, we went to teach O-level students, maths, science and English. And well, while we taught the students, we understood that these students were to write O-levels in like 6 months, in 4 months, but they did not know grade 10 basic maths, right? But when we went to the principal, the school was very run down, but that's the main school in all of Monaragala that has over 4,000 students entirely. But when we went and spoke to the principal, the only thing he told us was, just for me, my goal is for 2 or 3 people to get A's and go to Colombo. Everyone else, they will find their way. That was the mindset of the adult who was in charge of an entire school. So if we don't change that, I think the policymakers of this country need to change that in order for the next generation to have a safer and a more protective environment in the future.
And also, I think again, it need not be Monaragala, it's even in Colombo. You see, you want a cream, right? You push them through a mill and grind them and try to get these A's and whatever. And once you achieve that, that's it. The middle level,
Finished.
which is a wider spectrum, and the bottom, because this is a pyramid, right? Majority of people are left behind. Of course, now there is IT and a few things like that which is possible for people to go into, but unless it's medicine and engineering, nothing else people think of, right? And children are groomed from childhood, from Pahe Shishatya onwards, into this whole thing of mill where you push these people through.
And I feel very briefly, I feel the problem is the Ministry of Education has, I think, mandated that every school has a in-house counselor. But the problem is, because of a lack of trained professionals, a teacher within the school becomes a counselor, and students often go and try to open up to the teachers. And a phenomenon I've observed is those teachers actually, they don't maintain confidentiality. They go and talk about it in their staff rooms, and children get absolutely distorted by it.
I think it is the quality.
Yes.
It is a training which is important. You can't just pick somebody from the street and put a label and say, you're a counselor. But it is a very important process. I mean, something that we wanted to do when I was in Child Protection Authority was to have counselors in schools. But then it would start from a TOT or training of trainers and then go on and on and on, so that it branches out, because you can't bring all the teachers from all over the country, and then do that. But in the same time, we don't want, as it goes up, we don't want people to have independent ideas, their own thought processes. So therefore, there should be some monitoring processes to see whether this process is going on properly. So it has to be inbuilt with this, rather than just, okay, all right, we'll have this or that. That's not going to work.
But I think it's very important that all teachers in schools must go through some psychological some training to understand the different levels of the students, because as you said before, they only help the ones who are very, very clever.
But the problem is the expertise to give that training to the teachers.
You don't have.
Not that we don't have, it's limited, and the practicality of doing that is the problem. So what you need is to, first of all, promote and establish psychology as a subject. Most of the people who are psychologists come here, they can't find a job, and they find a job very easily in the West without a problem, and they go off and we lose all these people. So first of all, we need to give recognition to these people, and then establish a fairly big group of people who can train others and then give them the opportunity. I think as far as official positions are concerned, only a few psychologists in the university you get, but not in other institutions. But some of them actually get into the commercial area where psychology is used to promote food items and marketing.
Just a small thing to add on to what Chiranti said. I have not just heard of but also witnessed firsthand a friend, so I can vouch for what she said, as to it does not just happen in government schools but also international schools as well. As I went to an international school, a friend of mine was going through a lot during A-levels, advanced level examinations, the year leading up to it, but he had a lot of problems, and he had opened up to a teacher who claimed to be a counselor, and this teacher had spoken to him for around 1.5 hours. I saw it firsthand, but the next moment he went out of that room and the teacher left to another room. But while he walked through the corridor, he heard him and I both heard the teacher talking to 3 other teachers about what he said about another teacher traumatizing him.
Disgraceful.
So this was
Confidentiality, where is it?
So this broke that child's trust, and this guy
Absolutely.
mentioned that he would never trust anyone to open
Yeah,
up this
sure.
much again. So once you also tarnish the name of a counselor or a psychiatrist, even that profession becomes something someone could never look up to again.
Sure.
I think the main issue is, as a nation, what we have is a breakdown in integrity.
Absolutely.
Now I am sure a teacher doesn't join the profession thinking I will only send a couple of fellows to get A's, but what happens is, unfortunately, our system is such, we see that at every level.
Just one thing, I feel that this whole mentality of getting A's by the administration has a lot to do with promotions. Like, you go up the ladder as a principal or a teacher if your students have higher A's, I feel.
Yeah, no, I think it is linked to tuition, private tuition,
Absolutely.
where all these people are
money.
involved in it. I mean, it's like even doctors do private practice,
Yes.
and they get various promotions to promote themselves. So
You're saying,
I
sorry.
don't know.
No, because if you see, it's the integrity factor that has, there is a breakdown there.
Completely.
And from there onwards, everything is in a mess. Now, if you look at all this, if the doctors do their job, the teachers do their job, the policemen do their job properly, imagine what we can achieve. But the thing is, the system, the majority has broken the system. And as Professor earlier said also, if there is discipline, what if we break the law, but but it has become the norm. You get caught, you will get a fine $3,000, so give him 1,000. Yeah, that's okay, that's fine. But then we find a problem when somebody else takes a larger bribe, So I think that's why we at Avankalanka, what we are trying to say is, let's bring back that integrity. Let's hold the authorities accountable. Let's be accountable first, and then I think most of these issues we can solve if everybody tries to get into that mode. And that is where I think we invite the educated public to join this, because I'm sure we can lead by example.
Thank you. I think we have to stop there. Thank you for your participation. Until next Wednesday, don't forget to tune into our television Talk Walk at 6:30 p.m. Thank you for watching. This is Minoli de Almeida signing off.